Right, and there we go. Thank you very much. So I'll be talking about how we used specifications grading in a course George Kinnear and I developed in 2018 up here at the University of Edinburgh. And I will also be reporting some data about the student experience we have of that gathered in conjunction with Anna Wood. So a brief sketch of what I want to cover in this talk. I will outline where the course sits in our program, what it's doing, and briefly show you how it's delivered. Then I'll talk about specifications grading in principle and how we implement it in this course, and then the outcomes in various senses of using that approach. The course then is Fundamentals of Algebra and Calculus, FAC or FAC. There are lots of interesting things to talk about in FAC, and I will not go into most of them here. So I instead direct people to this article by George that there is a reference for here. So before 2018, this is what the curriculum of the first year of the BSc Maths degree looked like at Edinburgh. We had 3 core courses, then in line with the broad Scottish education, room for 3 options. In 2018, this new course, Fundamentals of Algebra and Calculus, appeared alongside the Semester 1 core course as an option. The syllabus of the course was modelled on that of Advanced Higher Maths and A-Level Further Maths. It was designed to offer students who haven't had an opportunity to study those qualifications some exposure to that material, or students who needed a bit more practice with that kind of material, a chance to get that practice. So it was aimed at students coming in with slightly lower entry qualifications than their peers. So in terms of content, it does roughly what it says on the tin. Some algebra topics in a loose general sense, 3-dimensional vectors, polynomials, graphs of functions, complex numbers, and then lots of calculus, integration and differentiation. It was delivered almost entirely online. For our purposes, assume it was delivered online. I will briefly mention the couple of small in-person elements a little later on, but the delivery and assessment of the course entire was done through Stack. This is what a typical week looked like. We taught for 10 weeks and we had 10 topics, so we devoted each week to one topic. Here is week 4, Principles of Integration. And I should say in the Moodle page for the conference, there is a link to, in the Stack section, a demo of, I think, week 3 from FAC, if people are interested to see more of how the course was delivered. So this was what the students saw when they logged in for a week. There's a little bit of getting started motivation at the beginning. Then you see 4 areas of content proper, area under a curve, etc. These were designed to take students about 2 hours to work through each. So that's analogous to a classic 50-minute lecture with associated practice and preparation. Then there is a practice quiz and a final test at the end. So those consisted of banks of about, well, between 9 and I think 15 questions in each of those. Questions very much like the students had already seen in the preceding delivery, which I'll show you in a minute. And with a 90-minute time limit on each of those 2 tests, all delivered through Stack questions. I will talk more about how they combined to give the grade for the course when we come to specifications grading, but that the final test for this week was what the whole week was leading up to. So the delivery of the course, when they click into, for example, section 2 on antiderivatives, look like this. It doesn't matter that we can't read it. The point is to show what kind of thing the students are engaging with. So there's a chunk of textbook-like exposition, giving definitions and theorems and things, but then that's followed in this principle that we call the textbook in the quiz, with simple questions for students to attempt to check their understanding. And as they work through the material using the menu on the left, you see at the end there's a load of mixed practice questions, which ends this roughly 2 hours of work. So these questions that the students come across, they're all delivered through Stack, and they don't contribute anything towards the mark. They're entirely for the students to treat how they will. They can do them as many times as they like, getting different random versions of the questions, or indeed they can do them no times at all, and I'll come back to that. It's not just text and questions. We also spent a lot of time, George and I, making video worked examples, and also tried to incorporate some more interactive matching and sorting activities and that sort of thing. So that's a very brief overview of what the course looked like. Now I'll talk about specifications grading. In theory, the principle is to get away from spending time stressing about whether something is worth 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, certainly an issue when you're doing human marking, and instead just have a set of individual assessments that are binary marked. They either pass or fail, depending on whether they meet a certain rubric or a certain threshold mark. Some amount of resubmission is permitted for any individual assessments that are failed, and then the final outcome for the course is determined by how many of those individual assessments are passed. So, how did we implement this in FAC? We recall, at the end of a typical week, we have this practice quiz and a final test. And as I say, the questions in these were no different to the kind of questions the students had encountered already. In fact, in a couple of cases, I think George and I did actually just clone a question from the preceding material and put it in one of these two. There's no distinction of difficulty between the two tests. We just wrote a load of questions and divided them up in between the two. Each had a time limit of 90 minutes, although it should have been possible to complete them in shorter time. And the interrelations between them and how they determine the grade is as follows. The practice quiz itself does not contribute to the mark for that week, except insofar as it needs to be unlocked, needs to be passed rather, to unlock the final test. And by pass, we mean get 80% on that test when all the questions are attempted. The students can attempt it as many times as they like, and they get full automated feedback from Stack on their attempts. Once they have passed that practice quiz, then they can attempt the final test. This is that individual assessment that needs to be passed. And 80% again is required to constitute a pass in this final test. We say there was a single attempt. If they failed, then 24 hours later, a resit test was made available, again with the same pass mark. And we refined the binary marking a little in so much as we distinguished between passing the final test at 80%, which was a mastery, or at 95% distinction. So for each of the 10 weeks of the course, we had as an outcome from the final test either a fail, a mastery, or a distinction. And then those possible results for each of those 10 weekly tests were put together in the following way to determine what the overall grade for the course was. And then that was converted to a percentage just for number crunching purposes. So for example, if all 10 weekly units were mastered, but only 4 were given a distinction, then that gets you a grade B. To get grade A1, you need to get all 10 at level distinction. And to even just pass the course, you need to get a mastery in at least 7 of those 10 units. Okay, so in that sense, there are quite high standards going on here, because that means you needed to get at least 80%, at least 7 of the 10 weekly tests to pass this course. Okay, so how did this come out. The most worrying thing for us was what the results would look like. You know, given this way of doing things, were we going to end up failing everybody or anything like that? So let me just show you the results from the 2 years that we've run the course so far. First year, 2018-19, we had 113 students, and the mean 67, median 70, pass rate 94, a grade distribution that looked exactly like we would expect and hope from a normal human marked exam paper. This academic year just finishing, very similar looking thing, a few more students on it this year, 181, but again, comparable mean, comparable median, and pass rate. So nothing disastrous there, most importantly. But let me talk now about a couple of possible consequences away from just the grade distribution. There is a very real risk of early failure, because if we remind ourselves that we needed to pass at least 7 of these 10 weekly units, then if a student fails the first 4, then they've failed the course already. And that's not going to lead to a good student experience. I should say I'm no longer involved with this course. George has taken it over entirely. But in the first year, I don't recall this being a problem. But we should be on guard about how to mitigate this. So 3 comments to make. Firstly is just to offer lots of support for this course. So let me comment on a couple of the in-person things that we did use. All our students on this course had access to the year 1 maths drop-in base that we run at the university in person. We also set up the Piazza online discussion forum for the course, as we do with many of our other courses up here at Edinburgh. And thirdly, we put the students in what we call autonomous learning groups, groups of about 6, and set them weekly tasks to complete. But otherwise, we left them to their own devices. We did not book space for them. We did not timetable meetings for them. We did not staff anything. We just left them to get on with it. But the point was to help build some community and give them a context in which they could discuss elements of the course with their peers. So that's the sense of the support that was offered. Secondly, I know George did keep an eye on the progress of students and intervene to pick up on people who were in danger of falling into that trap. So if they'd failed the first 2 weeks or something, a gentle email would be sent to check in on what was going on. That's one aspect of this that doesn't scale necessarily particularly easily, whereas the rest of the course does. However, there are automatic ways of doing this, of which I'm aware, things like on task, I believe. I've not at least looked into it in detail, but it is something out there that will do that kind of thing. Thirdly, it's not quite true what I said, actually. We did offer a later opportunity for resubmission after the end of teaching. During the revision period, we opened up all the final tests again for people to reattempt. So there was, in fact, another opportunity for people to pass, and therefore it wasn't, in fact, completely the end of the game if they had failed the first 4 tests. But it is something you need to make some kind of mitigation for. Now let me talk about, as I say, some of the data we have about how the students experience the course, in particular the grading system, which we've got from conducting interviews with students on the course in the past 2 years. And as I say, this was work done in conjunction also with our colleague Anna Wood, who came up with this mind map of themes relating to the grading system, which was one of the things that came up most in the interviews. This idea of the 80% pass mark. In a positive sense, it was related to a high expectation of achievement. Students accepted that this material was slightly lower level than their other mathematics university courses, and therefore we should have high standards of them, and they should be attaining highly in this course. And that had consequences for how they treated it. They really did, I remember some quotations, dig deep into the material and really push themselves to get everything right and work very hard at it. So that was a positive outcome. There were slightly less encouraging outcomes from the 80% pass mark. Inevitably, it led to a degree of frustration. Students getting 75%, 79%, and feeling they were sort of entitled to get some credit for that, but getting literally none. And this also combined with the fact that to be able to attempt the final test at all, they had to unlock it by passing the practice test. They had to keep sometimes hammering away at the practice test to pass it. And that was one of the things that contributed to a perception of the course having quite a high workload. And those two things combined to encourage behaviors which Anna described as gaming the system, whereby students work through the course, shall we say, not in the manner intended. For example, a student, when week 4, for example, was released, they didn't have to work through the material that I showed you earlier. They could, and indeed some did, choose to just bypass all the content and go straight to the practice quiz and immediately start at that. Sometimes choosing just to enter 0 if they didn't know how to answer a question, just to generate the automatic feedback, and then take from the results of that what bits of content they maybe needed to look at, and then try to pass the practice quiz again, then go straight into the final test. The game became passing the course rather than actually learning anything. I think I'm paraphrasing one of the quotations. So we need to figure out ways of mitigating these possible problems as well. And there are obvious things you can do. Make sure you have reasonably few marks per input. So, you know, if you have only 10 questions on the final test and there's only 1 input for each of those questions, then getting 3 of them wrong will get you a fail. So try to make sure that questions have, you know, multiple inputs, and essentially that not too many marks are riding on 1 chunk of input from the student. So this is an example of one of the final test questions from week 4. One thing that came up a lot, students commenting on about the difference between something that would have been human marked on paper, is that they felt they weren't getting any partial credit. If they got something wrong and were just out by a minus sign, then, well, that was that. It was wrong, and there was no more to be said. So we tried to build in some award of partial credit, and Stack can do this. This is one of the joys of it, by using the potential response trees in sensible ways. Here's a question: fully factorize this polynomial, and the answer given here is indeed a factorization of the polynomial, so some credit has been given, but it's not fully factorized, so not full credit has been given. So there are lots of opportunities for you to do that. Also, if you want to go down a line of guessing common errors, you can award credit if a student appears to have got most of it right, but made one of these common errors. For example, the classic case would be forgetting the constant of integration when computing an indefinite integral. If they've got it right except for that, you can choose to award some partial credit. And a similar principle is carrying errors forward. Again, you can use the potential response trees in Stack to enable a student, once an error has been made, not to be repeatedly penalized. So here it doesn't matter what the question is, but it asks for a formula, then asks for the derivative of that formula. I've got the formula wrong, but I've differentiated it correctly, and therefore I have been given some partial credit for that. And that makes the experience fairer for the students. So in early questions, we weren't doing that so much, but even as we were developing the course, we started to try to incorporate that, because we were getting feedback of frustration about the absence of that quite rapidly. So with those things said, I just want to conclude. The specifications grading system, it encourages high standards. Students rose to it and really did try to get things right. On the other hand, it did lead to some frustration, which led to some questionable behaviors working through the course, shall we say. And so to mitigate those problems, some careful question writing is required, but Stack does have the power to allow that. But most importantly, it promotes what's called mastery of the subject, right? A student who has passed this course has got 80% of the questions right on at least 7 of the 10 weekly units, which is rather different to the traditional scraping a pass of 40 by getting all the very easiest questions correct. So as suits material of this level, we can be sure that anyone who has passed this course really can do the majority of the work required in the material, which is what we want. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was a very interesting talk. We've got a few questions. We'll see how many we get through in a few minutes. So first of all, I have a question from John McDermott about the autonomous learning groups.
Yep.
He says, what sorts of tasks did you set these groups? And were they designed to link into the weekly topics and tests?
Yes, so each week we set them a topic based on that week. So hopefully something that was designed to promote discussion and collaboration among the groups. I'm trying to remember some of the actual tasks we used. I think in the first week on vectors, I cooked up something whereby there were 4 different vectors, but described in about 12 different ways, and the students had to collect together the 3 descriptions of the same vector and partition the different descriptions into which ones describe the same vector. Things like that. Should say these didn't work particularly well because we did ask them to complete these tasks. We did ask them to submit them, but we did not then mark them or really look at them in any detail except to see whether anything had been handed in, because again, that wasn't going to scale well. So it was just a motivation to get students to meet, and I think they quickly realized that if they didn't meet, nothing would really happen. So I know that is something that George is thinking hard about how to improve this year in particular.
Okay, we have a question from Thomas Cottrell about the grading system. He says, it seems like with this grading system, it's possible to pass with 54%. He's computing percentages by adding up tests. So you get 80% in 7 tests and 0 in the others. And it's also possible to fail with something like 88%, where you get 100% in 6 tests and slightly less than 80 in the other 4. Am I right about this, he asks, and was it deliberately designed this way? So this is really about specifications grading.
Yeah, so I haven't done the arithmetic, but that sounds plausible. Yeah, so the design is to ensure, so to the point of there being a discrepancy about the percentages there, that you pass with a lower mark than a fail. It's designed so that a student must be able to do most of the content in the course, right? That it's not enough to be really good just at differentiating and thereby pass the whole course fundamentals of algebra and calculus. You really needed to be on top of some aspects of differentiation and integration and vectors, graphs of functions and so on. So that's the big difference in the specifications grading system, that it ensures that there is a minimum achievement in a certain reasonably large amount of the material there in the course.
Okay, one more question. Is your, from James Faraday, is your brackets involved final marking scheme, the letter grades I think that means, based on theory from Linda Nilsson's book?
I would have to defer to George on that. He actually came up with the details of the precise marking scheme. So I'll be honest, I can't answer whether it's a direct taken directly from the book.
George is here, so
yes, he is. Yes.
Yeah, so actually it's turtles all the way down. I can't say either, actually. So this came to us from our director of teaching at the time, Toby Bailey. But I believe it was certainly inspired by that. if not that book, then the set of ideas around it that he first heard about specifications grading.
Okay, great. I think there's maybe one or two more questions on the Moodle site, which we don't have time to take. So Richard, if you could have a look through those in your own time, please.
Yep, fine.
Yep. So thank you again, Richard.